The words still echoed in my ears long after the door slammed in my face. My mother's voice had been sharp, almost rehearsed, as if she had been waiting for the moment. "Your father is dead. You have no place in this house," she said, her hand gripping the doorknob with finality. Behind her stood Victor, her new husband, leaning casually against the hallway wall as though the house already belonged to him. He smirked when the door shut, and that image stayed with me as I stood on the front steps. The house loomed behind me, a white colonial on Walnut Street in Brookline, Massachusetts. Its black shutters and brick walkway had always felt warm when my father was alive, but now they seemed cold and foreign. A maple tree stretched across the front yard, its branches still heavy with late autumn leaves. My father had loved that tree. I could still picture him out there every fall with a rake, laughing as the wind scattered the piles he had just gathered. Now it only reminded me of what I had lost. I stood there with nothing but my suitcase and my father's old leather satchel, the one he used to carry documents to and from his study. The air smelled like rain, damp and sharp, and I felt frozen in place. At 28, I should have been strong enough to face this, but in that moment, I felt like a child again, powerless against the cruelty of a mother who no longer saw me as her daughter, but as an obstacle in her new life. Then, like a sudden flash, I remembered something my father had told me 2 winters ago. We had been sitting in his study, the green banker's lamp glowing softly on the desk, his voice low and serious. "If anything ever feels wrong, Claire, open the locker behind the Emerson print. Only Thomas knows about it. He will help you." I hadn't thought much of it then. My father had always been meticulous, a man who planned for every detail. But now, standing alone on the sidewalk with nowhere to go, his words came back to me with a new weight. Thomas. He had been with us for more than 20 years, our houseman, caretaker, and in many ways, the quiet guardian of our family. He lived in the small apartment above the garage and kept the house running like clockwork. My mother never liked him, mostly because he answered only to my father, but I trusted him. He was steady, calm, and above all, loyal. I tightened my grip on the satchel and walked quickly around the block to the back alley. My heart pounded as I reached the side door. I pressed the bell once and waited. Within moments, Thomas opened it. His face was calm as always, but his eyes widened when he saw me standing there in the drizzle with my suitcase. Without asking a single question, he pulled me inside. The familiar scent of the mudroom hit me first, laundry detergent and lemon polish. Thomas didn't speak until I sank into a chair in the small kitchen and wrapped my hands around the cup of tea he placed in front of me. The warmth steadied me, but my voice shook when I told him what had happened at the front door. His face hardened, though he didn't look surprised. He nodded once, the kind of nod that carried quiet certainty, then motioned for me to follow him. We walked down the hall into my father's study. The sight of it nearly undid me. Everything was as he had left it, the shelves lined with leather-bound books, the scent of cedar and ink, and the desk where he had spent countless evenings. But there were intrusions now, ugly reminders that the house no longer felt like home. A golf bag belonging to Victor leaned against the corner, a silent claim of ownership that made my chest tighten with anger. I turned my back on it. Thomas walked to the wall behind the desk and lifted the framed Emerson print that hung there. Behind it was a steel locker, its surface dull but solid, with a round dial lock. My father's voice returned in my memory, reciting the numbers like a poem, urging me to never forget. My hands trembled as I turned the dial. Left, right, left. A soft click broke the silence. The locker door swung open, revealing a flat wooden box, a thick red folder, and a sealed envelope with my name written in my father's unmistakable handwriting. My breath caught. With shaking fingers, I tore open the envelope. "My dear Claire, if this letter has reached you, it means I am gone. I could not trust your mother to honor my wishes. I loved her once, but her love for money swallowed the rest. Everything I built belongs with you. The enclosed will and instructions place the entire estate in your name. Not half. Not a trust you cannot control. All of it. I told only Thomas, so he could guide you to this locker if anyone tried to push you aside. Go to attorney Margaret Hale at Hale, Duncan and Price in Boston. She will know what to do. I have structured the assets so they cannot be moved the way your mother thinks. Value at last review was approximately $2 billion. It is not luck. It is 40 years of work. Use it to live well and do good. Do not look back. Love.
Dad.
The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. My father had known this day might come. He had prepared for it. And he had trusted me, not her. The red folder held his will, freshly signed, with every asset clearly listed, real estate schedules, bank accounts, share ledgers, and even a key to a safe deposit box at Commonwealth Bank on Boylston Street. Each page bore my name. I felt grief and relief twist inside me like two storms colliding. My father was gone, and nothing could change that. But his love and foresight had given me more than money. He had given me protection, strength, and a path forward. Thomas rested his hand gently on my shoulder. Miss Clare, he said, his voice steady, your father planned for this. We will follow his plan. I nodded, wiping my eyes. The girl who had stood powerless on the sidewalk was gone. My father had made sure of it. I was no longer the one cast out. I was the rightful heir, the owner of the house, and of everything he had worked for. I slipped the will and the key back into the satchel and stood taller than I had all day. The study around me no longer felt haunted. It felt like mine. My father's voice no longer echoed in memory. It spoke through every word of his letter. Thomas, I said, turning to him with a steadiness that surprised me, tomorrow we go see Margaret Hale. For the first time that day, Thomas smiled. Yes, Miss Clare, he replied. First thing in the morning. The next morning, the Boston sky was a flat sheet of gray, the kind of color that seemed to press down on the city. I wore a navy dress and a wool coat that had once belonged to my grandmother, a piece of her warmth I carried with me. Thomas drove the old black Audi that my father had kept in the carriage bay. Its leather seats smelled faintly of polish and tobacco, the same scent that always clung to my father's jackets. Neither of us spoke much during the ride. The silence was heavy, but steady, like two soldiers before a battle. We parked near the public garden and walked to the glass building that housed Hale, Duncan, and Price. The lobby smelled faintly of new carpet and fresh coffee. Everything about it felt clinical, precise, the opposite of the chaos I had felt in my mother's voice the day before. A receptionist led us to a corner conference room with wide windows overlooking the common. I tried to steady my hands against the polished table. Moments later, Margaret Hale entered. She was in her 50s, tall and composed, with a silver bob that framed a face lined more by wisdom than age. Her presence filled the room without effort. She shook my hand firmly, then glanced at Thomas with recognition before turning back to me. Your father told me to expect you someday, she said, her voice calm but edged with sadness. I only wished it would be later. I slid the envelope and the red folder across the table. She opened them carefully, her eyes moving with quick precision across each page. The room was silent except for the shuffle of paper. When she looked up again, her eyes were both kind and sharp, like steel softened by velvet. Your father was exact, she said. This will revoke all prior documents. He also used transfer-on-death designations for most of the accounts, which means no one can touch them before probate. The safe deposit box key you found is vital. It likely holds the original shares and bearer notes. We'll need to act quickly. We'll file for probate to appoint you as personal representative. At the same time, we'll request a temporary restraining order to freeze any attempt by your mother to sell or move property. That will keep everything intact. Her decisiveness was like oxygen after a night of suffocating grief. Within minutes, she was on the phone with her paralegal, dictating the petition. Another call went out to the courthouse clerk, and a third to a process server. Papers began sliding in front of me, and I signed each one with hands that felt steadier the more I moved the pen. Finally, she pulled a thick black binder from the shelf and set it in front of me. Here is the estate snapshot from our last review with your father, she explained. The house in Brookline is free and clear. He also owned a brownstone on Beacon Hill that's leased to a law firm for $800,000 a year. The largest asset is his 71% stake in Harrow North Analytics. They've just secured a federal data contract worth over $1.4 billion across 5 years. In addition, he held municipal bonds, a fine art collection, and various cash equivalents. At last appraisal, the estate totaled just over $2 billion. The words seemed to make the air shimmer. I gripped the table, steadying myself. "My mother has the house key," I said quietly. "She's already trying to make it hers." Margaret's eyes sharpened. "Then we'll change the locks with a sheriff present. You have the right, not her. The will makes that clear. Until the court confirms, this restraining order will serve as your shield." By 3 that afternoon, we were standing before a probate judge in Suffolk County. The courtroom smelled faintly of dust and paper. Margaret spoke with the precision of a surgeon, laying out the will, the affidavit, the estate list, and the risks of waste or concealment by my mother and her new husband. The judge's pen scratched across the order. With one signature, the temporary restraining order was granted. I felt as though iron doors had slammed shut around the estate, locking it safe from her reach. From the courthouse, we drove directly to the Commonwealth Bank. The safe deposit room was silent, its walls lined with polished brass. My hand trembled as I slid the key into the slot. Inside the box, we found the original signed will, share certificates, a small encrypted thumb drive, and a handwritten note in my father's familiar hand. It read only one line: "Trust the numbers, not the noise." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I swallowed them down. We signed the inventory, and Margaret arranged for immediate secure copies. Then she made one last call that day, to a locksmith and the sheriff's office. By evening, we stood again in front of the Brookline house. The maple tree rustled faintly in the cold air, as though it had been waiting. The officer explained the order when my mother opened the door. Her face drained of color as she read the paper. Victor stood behind her with a drink in his hand, his smirk replaced by unease. She looked at me, her expression torn between rage and disbelief. "You ungrateful girl," she hissed. "I kept this home together while your father worked. It belongs to me." I met her eyes, the steadiness in my voice, surprising even me. "It belongs to me. By his will, by the court, and by his intent. You can take your clothes and your keepsakes. Nothing more." The officer's presence made the rules clear. The locksmith waited by the steps, tools in hand. Victor opened his mouth to argue, but quickly closed it when the sheriff shifted his weight. My mother muttered curses under her breath as she packed. Within 2 hours, she and Victor were gone, shoved into the back of a yellow cab with 2 suitcases and a bitterness that clung to the air even after the taillights vanished. The locksmith got to work immediately. By the time the night deepened, every lock on the house had been replaced. The receipt came to $3,400, and I paid in cash, adding a $100 tip just to feel the satisfaction of it. When the front door shut behind me, the sound echoed differently this time. It was not rejection. It was closure. I leaned my forehead against the wood, breathing deeply. The maple tree outside rustled as if it approved, its branches swaying in the chill night air. For the first time since my father's funeral, I felt safe inside these walls. That night, as I walked through the halls of the house, I noticed things I hadn't seen in years. The faint scratch on the dining room table from one of my childhood science projects. The creak on the 3rd stair. The scent of cedar lingered in the study. These were not just memories, they were claims of belonging. Margaret sent me a text before I went to bed. "Confirmation hearing in 10 days. Hold steady." I typed back, "I will." And I meant it. The 10 days leading up to the confirmation hearing felt like a wire pulled too tight. Each hour seemed stretched and brittle, ready to snap. My mother wasted no time. She filed a contest against the will, claiming I had manipulated my father while he was ill. Her petition read like a personal attack, painting me as a conniving daughter who preyed on a dying man. Victor added his own affidavit, a jumble of accusations and insinuations that sounded more like a gossip column than a legal document. I should have expected it, but when I read the words, I felt the sting of betrayal all over again. Sleep became scarce. I wandered the halls at night, my hands brushing against the walls my father had painted years before. I made coffee at 2 in the morning and sat by the window, watching Boston's lights flicker in the distance. The house creaked with silence, but I felt my father's presence in the stillness. Whenever the doubts clawed at me, I remembered his handwriting in the letter. Trust the numbers, not the noise. Margaret worked tirelessly to build a fortress around me. She assembled proof like stones in a wall. First came the handwriting expert, who confirmed with certainty that my father's signature on the will was genuine. Then she secured testimony from his physician, who provided clear medical notes showing that my father had been of sound mind at the time he signed. Each piece of evidence strengthened our case. The most important piece, however, came from the forensic accountant Margaret hired. His name was James Carter, a meticulous man in his 40s with a quiet intensity. He combed through the estate's accounts and, within days, uncovered 3 attempted transfers my mother had tried to initiate from an old joint account. She had moved to funnel nearly $600,000 into a separate account under Victor's name. James froze the transfers within hours and recovered the funds. When he presented his report, I felt a surge of pride. The numbers were back where they belonged, like birds returning to a branch. On the 5th day, I made my first visit to Harrow North Analytics, the company that had been my father's greatest professional achievement. Thomas accompanied me, his steady presence a reassurance, as I stepped into the sleek downtown building. The office still bore my father's mark. Clean lines, framed patents on the walls, and a sense of purpose in every corner. His personal office looked as though he had simply stepped out for a meeting. The sight nearly undid me. The board chair, Elaine Morgan, greeted me in the conference room. She was in her early 60s, sharp-eyed but warm, with the kind of presence that commanded respect without intimidation. She had been with Harrow North since the very beginning. She shook my hand firmly and said, "Your father was a builder. He trusted you to carry this forward." Elaine showed me the pipeline of contracts, including the massive federal data services deal my father had secured just months before his death. The numbers were staggering, but Elaine broke them down with precision: cash flow, obligations, revenue forecasts. She explained how my 71% stake gave me controlling power. My father had even left a recommendation letter naming Elaine as the person he trusted to chair the board in his absence. Reading his words felt like hearing his voice again. With my signature, I confirmed Elaine as interim chair. She accepted the role with dignity, promising a clean audit and a steady hand. For the first time since the funeral, I felt a flicker of confidence. The company was strong, and with it, so was my father's legacy. That weekend, as I was settling into the rhythm of preparing for court, a white envelope arrived in the mail with no return address. Inside was a stack of glossy photos. My mother and Victor were smiling as they toured a waterfront condo in Miami, champagne flutes in hand. Scrawled across one of the photos in Victor's messy handwriting were the words, "We will enjoy this with what is ours." For a moment, I stared at the pictures in disbelief. Then, unexpectedly, I laughed. The sound startled even me. For the first time in weeks, the weight on my chest loosened. Their arrogance was almost absurd. I placed the photos in a file and labeled it noise. My father's line echoed again. Trust the numbers, not the noise. Monday came, and with it the hearing. The courtroom was bright and compact, with pale wood benches and windows that let in a clear autumn light. My mother arrived dressed in black, her face painted in the sorrow of a widow. But her new wedding band betrayed her, flashing under the fluorescent lights every time she raised her hand. Victor sat 2 rows behind her, smirking like he was watching a play. Margaret opened our case with precision. She presented the will, the physician's notes, the expert handwriting analysis, and James Carter's financial report. Her voice never rose, but her words carried authority. She made it clear that my father had acted deliberately, that he had planned carefully, and that his intent could not be disputed. When my mother's lawyer attempted to suggest that Thomas had pressured my father, Thomas rose slowly from the bench. His voice was calm but firm as he described my father's routines, how he signed documents only after days of reflection, how he remained sharp until his final weeks, how he trusted numbers above all. He spoke without embellishment, just simple truth. The judge leaned forward, listening intently. My mother shifted uncomfortably, looking away. During a recess, I stepped into the hallway to catch my breath. The marble walls felt cold against my back. A woman in a navy suit with a gold pin approached and introduced herself as the chief investment officer at one of the banks my father had once used. She explained that an older trust account my mother's attorney had tried to reference was already closed and distributed years ago. "Your father kept his plans simple on purpose," she said with a faint smile. "Simplicity is strong." Her words eased a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. By the end of the day, the judge extended the restraining order and scheduled the final decision for the following week. As we left the courthouse, the Boston sky had cleared into a crisp blue. Thomas held out my coat for me, and I told him we would stop by my father's favorite chowder shop on the way home. We carried the warm bowls back to the house and ate quietly at the dining room table, the long scratch in the wood a reminder of a science project I had done there at 12 years old. That night, I walked through the house with new eyes. The creak in the third stair no longer bothered me. It was part of the story. The study felt like a ship's bridge, and I could almost see my father at the helm. In his spirit, I took out a yellow legal pad and began a list. Repair the porch. Refinish the floors. Install a ramp for Thomas's bad knee. Establish a scholarship fund for engineering students in Massachusetts and Vermont in my father's name. I wrote each item in clean, deliberate ink. Then I placed the pad on the desk, under the green banker's lamp, and turned it off. For the first time in weeks, I slept 6 straight hours. When I woke, the tight wire of waiting had not vanished, but it no longer controlled me. My heart felt steady, like the numbers in my father's ledger. The decision came on a bright Tuesday morning, the kind of day where the light falls clean across Boston streets, leaving no room for shadows. I sat in the courtroom with Margaret on my left and Thomas behind me, his steady presence like an anchor. When the judge spoke, his words were plain, but heavy with finality. The will is valid. There was no undue influence. The contest is denied. He signed the order with a firm stroke and added a brief note in the margin. The decedent's intent is clear. I read those words twice, then once more, letting them sink in. They felt like a hand on my shoulder, as if my father himself had reached across time to remind me I was not alone. Margaret allowed herself a rare smile and pulled me into a hug that surprised us both. "It's done," she whispered. Then she handed me a folder with a 60-day timeline, filings, inventories, property retitling, tax documents, and corporate governance tasks. The work ahead was immense, but it was purposeful work. The estate was mine to protect, mine to grow, mine to honor. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I let it ring through, but the voicemail played her voice anyway. My mother. "We need to talk," she said. "We are family. You can give us the Beacon Hill property. You have enough." Her tone was soft, almost pleading, but I heard the same edge that had cut me down on the front steps weeks before. That voice had told me I had no place in my father's house. That voice had chosen greed over love. I deleted the message without calling back. Instead, I did something final. I asked Margaret to prepare a letter that revoked every scrap of access my mother had once enjoyed. She wrote it in plain language, sparing no room for misinterpretation. I signed it, had it notarized, and sent it by sheriff's hand. It was not a fight. It was closure. That weekend, I invited the people who had stood by my father and me through the storm. Elaine from Harrow North came, bringing a bouquet of fresh tulips. James Carter, the accountant who had stopped the transfers, arrived with a file of updates. Margaret joined us, her sharp edges softened for once. And Thomas, loyal as ever, carved a roast in the kitchen just as he had on Christmas Eve every year. We gathered at the long dining table with the scratch still running across its center, the scar of my childhood science project. We told stories about my father's stubborn habits, his dry humor, the way he insisted on walking home from the office even in Boston's heaviest snow. We laughed, even cried, and when it came time to toast, We raised glasses of ginger ale. My father had never liked champagne. The months that followed were filled with both work and growth. The Beacon Hill brownstone was appraised at $11 million, and when the law firm renewed its lease, the terms increased by another $80,000 annually. Harrow North reported record revenue when the federal contract hit its first milestone, and Elaine kept her promise of clean governance. I redirected part of the municipal bonds into a clean energy fund, a choice my father would have admired. I also launched the scholarship I had promised myself that night in the study. $5 million went into an endowment for engineering students in Massachusetts and Vermont, students who came from modest means but carried big dreams. By Thanksgiving, the first letters arrived. They were simple, handwritten notes filled with gratitude and hope. I sat at the desk under the green banker's lamp, reading them one by one until my tears blurred the ink. My father's legacy wasn't just numbers, it was lives changed. Winter settled over Boston like a quiet blanket. Snow softened the streets and rooftops, turning the world outside the window white and still. I kept fresh flowers on my father's desk and had the maple tree in the front yard trimmed to withstand heavy snow. On quiet nights, I stood at the front door, palm pressed to the wood, listening to the house breathe. It no longer felt like a fortress under siege. It felt like home, mine, undeniably mine. One afternoon, as pale light stretched across the yard, my mother appeared at the gate. Victor hovered a step behind her, his posture nervous, but his face still carrying a trace of arrogance. I walked out to meet them, the cold air biting at my cheeks. She began speaking the moment I drew close. Her words tumbled out, about blood ties, forgiveness, fairness. She painted herself as the victim of misunderstanding, as though the past weeks hadn't happened. I listened in silence, letting her voice wash over me like static. Then, when she reached for the gate latch, I raised my hand. "This door is closed to you," I said firmly. "By my choice and by the courts. You taught me to leave when I was told I had no place. Now I have learned to stay where I belong." Her eyes met mine, sharp and searching, but she found no softness there. After a long pause, she stepped back. Victor cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze, and together they turned and walked away. I stayed at the walkway until they were gone, the maple branches whispering in the wind above me. That night, I sat once more at my father's desk with a yellow legal pad. I made a new list. Take Thomas to Cape Cod in June for a week of rest. Paint the upstairs hallway a warm cream to soften the light. Read my father's old engineering notebooks, not for their technical detail, but to learn how he thought. Leave the world better than I found it. I tucked the list into the red folder in the hidden locker and closed the steel door. I no longer chased the past. I no longer explained myself to those who had chosen greed over love. My father's letter stayed in the top drawer, his words etched in my mind. Trust the numbers, not the noise. The house on Walnut Street is mine now. The study feels like a bridge, and I stand at the helm. My mother's voice no longer fills the halls. The doors stay closed to her, but open to the future. And when I walk down Commonwealth Avenue after a storm, the streets feel wide and clean, as though they were waiting for me all along. I carry my father's light with me. My name is on the deeds. My hands rest on the rail. And I move forward with steady steps, no longer the girl turned away, but the woman who stayed where she belonged.